Good afternoon from Cape Town, and good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Thank you very much for joining us on this session. I'm very excited for the session that we have this afternoon, and we've got a star-studded panel. I think we're going to have a very exciting discussion around a very pertinent issue, a very pertinent topic on the continent. We'll be discussing the tobacco control sustainability and discussing the tobacco control funding landscape. And of course, how to establish tobacco control funds on the continent. Are these worth the effort? Is this the direction that the continent should be thinking of, countries on the continent should be thinking of? And to kick us off on this journey, I think we have a star-studded panel. We've got Jeremiah Spoor from the WHO. We've got Dr. Abdallah Bohabib, who's from the Ministry of Health in Mauritania. And hopefully we'll also be joined by a representative from the Ministry of Health in Kenya, Dr. Omondi. And of course, we've also been joined by Yolanda Richardson, who's representative from the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, CTFK. So to get started, I'm going to jump right in and introduce Dr. Jeremiah Spoor. Dr. Spoor is the current head of the fiscal policies for health unit at the WHO's Department of Health Promotion. And he'll be talking to us a little bit about some of what the WHO has done in terms of work regarding tobacco taxation and just economics of tobacco control in general. And how we can start to think about sustainable ways of financing tobacco control on the continent. So Dr. Spoor, over to you.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference. Today, I'm going to talk about tobacco control sustainability, but with a focus on increasing tobacco taxes in Africa. My key messages are: reforming tobacco taxation is a necessary condition for establishing effective and efficient functioning tobacco control funds in Africa. Second, that reforming and raising tobacco taxation or taxes in Africa is smart. Third, that establishing a tobacco control fund is a good option for sustaining tobacco control, but is not a silver bullet. When we talk about progress in tobacco taxation in Africa, I would say that there is some progress, but more needs to be done. If you look at the map comparing 2010 and 2020, and the shades of brown is from 0 to less than 50% in total tax share, and shades of green is from higher than 50 to over 75% of the total tax is, and the retail price is taxed. So if you look at this map, 13 countries have actually moved up to higher tax category since 2010. So there is some progress. Nonetheless, if you look at the Tobacco Economics Tax Scorecard, this is a snapshot for 2018. The average overall score in 2018 for the Africa region is 1.36. This is really a composite score that looks at cigarette prices, cigarette affordability, tax structure, and the share of taxes in retail prices. There's certainly a lot of room for tobacco taxes to grow in Africa, which can be used for establishing a tobacco control fund. What needs therefore to be done? In Africa, you need to apply tobacco tax best practices. You need to simplify tax structure, less reliance on ad valorem taxes. You need to increase tobacco taxes significantly to reduce affordability, and you need to tax all tobacco products in a comparable way. My second point is that reforming and raising tobacco taxes in Africa is smart, especially in the context of COVID, where more and more countries are really facing increased pressures for revenues and increased pressures to increase spending for health. In fact, a World Bank study showed that there's going to be a double shock from COVID, and therefore one needs really to raise revenues, including from pro-health taxes, which includes tobacco taxation. Tobacco taxation saves lives, mobilizes resources, addresses health inequities, reduces health system burdens, and target NCD risk factors. And tobacco use is a major risk factor for NCD. I'd like to stress this because Africa is just in the beginning of the tobacco epidemic. The third point I'd like to stress that even if you have the funds from raised tobacco taxes, you still need to spend wisely and strengthen governance arrangements. When you're talking about tobacco control funds, no one size fits all. At the end of the day, the choice depends on country context, the fiscal and legal system. You can structure the fund as a unit or the department in a ministry, an autonomous body, like a foundation, or a semi-autonomous body. But what is more important than, if not more important than structuring a tobacco control fund, is making sure that you spend the funds that are available. The worst thing that can happen to a tobacco control fund, as an experience in some countries, is they have available funds, but they are not spent. So at the end of the day, even if you were to earmark funds to a tobacco control fund, they need to be spent. You need to strengthen governance arrangements, and you need to spend wisely. At the end of the day, we need to be bold. We need to spend wisely. We need to go smart tobacco taxes, for after all, health is wealth. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, JP, for that. So, JP, thank you very much for that presentation. And to the audience, just I've posted a quick note as well, just to let everybody know you can ask questions using the Hover app, and we will try and get to as many of those questions during the Q&A session. But for this particular section, I would like to just sort of continue some of the discussion around what you've presented here, JP, and really just delve a little more detail around what you spoke about regarding some of the issues that I think governments need to think about before, attempting to even start up tobacco control funds. You were instrumental in the Philippines during your time as Undersecretary there, and the time you were setting up the sin tax reforms in the Philippines. Perhaps you could talk us through, based on that kind of experience, what you think the governments really need to focus on and think about before even setting up a tobacco control fund.
Yeah, first, thank you very much, Sunda. I think you really have to work closely, health and finance and other sectors. There should really be a whole of government approach, because we are really, when we're talking about raising tobacco taxes, for example, you're going against a very powerful adversary, which is the tobacco industry and their allies, which have really strong political connections, and they have deep pockets. And therefore, you need to have to gather a coalition of reform. The next lesson I think that can be learned from the Philippine experience is that you should frame tobacco tax reform as a health measure rather than a revenue measure. For the longest time in the past, since 1997, or even before that, tobacco taxation was framed as a revenue measure. But once you talk about revenue measure, you talk about a lot of technicalities, and you can argue about the price elasticity of demand. You talk about other things, including the scare tactics of the tobacco industry, which means that if you raise tobacco taxes, you increase smuggling, there are court and legal challenges. It's anti-poor, that revenues will go down and negative employment impact. However, if you're talking about health, most politicians do not want really to be seen against health. So that's really important, framing it as a health measure. And in fact, it's true because prevention is better than cure. And if you remember the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, it recognizes that tobacco taxation is really a very effective instrument to reduce tobacco use while raising revenues for development. I talked about coalition. Next is, since you really have to deal with the Ministry of Finance, you need to understand their mindset, value for money, spending wisely, efficiency, and effectiveness. And maybe one last thing is that one should not think that, that money does not buy love. So money does not also buy health. At the end of the day, it's really about just having the money is not sufficient. It's a necessary condition, but you need to spend wisely. That's why I would really argue that if you're among the fiscal measures, tobacco taxation is win-win-win. It's a win for public health, it's a win for revenues, and a win for equity. And at the end of the day, it's smart. It saves lives, mobilizes resources, addresses health inequities, reduces health system burdens, and targets tobacco use, which is a major risk factor for NCDs. Thank you very much.
That's perfect. That's excellent. JP, for that contribution. I've also noted quite a bit going on in the chat. Peter Yuko, thank you very much for the correction. I mentioned sin taxes. We're really moving towards health taxes because this is really where the discussion is, right?
Yes.
It's all about health at the end of the day, and this is what we want to make sure that we're addressing and framing the discussion in the right way. So thank you very much for that correction, Peter. And thank you very much, JP. We'll continue this discussion, I think, at a later point in the session. For now, what I'd like to do is move on to Dr. Abda. Dr. Abda is, he's currently the director of the Non-Communicable Diseases Center at the Ministry of Health in Mauritania. He's also the tobacco control focal point in the country. He comes with over 15 years of experience in tobacco control and was in fact the first director of the country's national tobacco control program. Dr. Buhaba, thank you very much for joining us. I would like to just sort of start off with you just sharing with us, your experience in Mauritania regarding tobacco control funds. So we know you've already got one set up. You've had it for a couple of years. Maybe you could just start by walking us through, what does your fund look like? Where does the money come from? What is it used for? And who sort of administers the funds? Over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Zonda. Merci pour tout le monde et bonjour. Merci pour cette opportunité dans cette première conférence internationale africaine de contrôle du tabac et du développement, car c'est véritablement un outil de développement de contrôle du tabac. Et je vais un peu partager avec vous justement l'expérience de la Mauritanie dans le cadre de ce qui s'appelle les fonds de lutte contre le tabac ou les fonds alimentés par les taxes du tabac. Comment on les avait mis en place, comment on les avait utilisés. Donc, next slide, un autre, s'il vous plaît. Le suivant, voilà. Donc, en Mauritanie, vous savez, il y a deux fonds qui sont alimentés par la taxation du tabac. Un premier fonds, parce qu'en fait, en Mauritanie, on avait commencé très tôt à savoir que le tabac, il faut un financement durable. Et cette durabilité mérite ou nécessite la mise en place de quelque chose qui va l'accompagner, cette durabilité, c'est-à-dire il faut trouver un moyen financier qui va accompagner tout ça. Et puis donc, on avait créé le premier compte, ou ce qu'on appelle le compte d'affectation spéciale, qui était alimenté par 7,5% des taxes sur le tabac de ces produits. Et c'est juste au début de la loi, avant que la loi soit mise en œuvre. C'est coïncidé avec la création d'un centre de référence en matière d'oncologie dans la sous-région de façon globale. Et donc, les autorités ont dit, bon, c'est l'occasion, on va essayer de financer les activités de centre d'oncologie avec ces taxes du tabac. Et donc, ils ont pris à peu près 85% de ces fonds, de ces 7,5% de la taxation du tabac ont été destinés à ce centre d'oncologie, dont la plus grosse partie était pour les médicaments essentiellement, qui sont des médicaments très chers. Il y avait une convention avec une compagnie de médicaments. Et donc, pour les équipements qui sont aussi très chers, étaient très modernes, la formation et l'équipement des laboratoires. C'était un peu au début ça. Et puis, il restait 15% qui est destiné au programme, avec S, le programme de lutte contre le cancer, y compris les programmes de lutte contre le tabac, l'activité physique, tout ce qui est facteur de risque qui est en liaison de près ou de loin avec le cancer. Et donc ça, c'est un fonds qui est utilisé depuis maintenant, depuis 2017-2018, et maintenant, on est au 5e ou 6e année. Ce fonds, jusqu'à présent, a déjà, dans ce compte, a été viré correspondant aux 7,5%, l'équivalent d'1,5 milliard de nos ouguiya mauritaniens. Je rappelle qu'un dollar est équivalent à 372 ouguiya de notre monnaie locale. À l'époque, la taxation, à un moment donné, était, depuis longtemps d'ailleurs, c'était une taxation de CAF, c'est la valeur déclarée, et on était parti progressivement de 30% en 2012, je pense, ou 2011, et arrivé en 2020 à 87%. Le Covid est arrivé, et le gouvernement, à un moment donné, pour des mesures économiques, il a détaxé tout le monde, toutes les choses à peu près, y compris le tabac, ce qui nous a créé véritablement des problèmes. On est parti de 87% à 29%. Et c'est ça, français. Et donc, on a eu cette chute en la deuxième moitié de 2020. Et donc, ce fonds continue à être alimenté par 7,5% de taxes et continue à financer 85% destinés au fonctionnement du Centre national d'oncologie et 15% pour les autres programmes de prévention et de lutte contre de prévention des cancers, dont le tabac. Nous avons adopté après la loi en 2018, et dans cette loi, il y a la création du Fonds national de lutte contre le tabac. C'est un fonds spécialement pour le tabac. Ce fonds il est créé par la loi, donc il existe par la loi. Maintenant, il faut une autre mesure, c'est le mettre en place par décret conjoint entre le ministère de la Santé et le ministère des Finances. Ça fait à peu près 1 an qu'il est en cours de finalisation. Je pense que maintenant, on est au stade presque de finir. Il y a eu énormément de discussions. Au début, il est alimenté lui aussi par 2 types de financement. Au début, on avait demandé 5% des taxes sur le tabac. Ils nous ont accepté seulement 2% des taxes sur le tabac, en plus de tout ce qui est amende dans le cadre de l'application de la loi tabac, c'est-à-dire la loi exige que 40% dans ce fonds et 60% dans le trésor. Donc voilà ces 2 fonds-là qui existent en Mauritanie. Le premier, c'est pour 7,5%, c'est pour la prévention. Il s'appelle Fonds de recherche et lutte contre les cancers. Les domaines éligibles, c'est les équipements, les médicaments, essentiellement, et un peu la prévention, la sensibilisation. Le deuxième fonds, c'est le Fonds national de lutte contre le tabac, qui est un fonds créé par la loi 2018-020 relative à la production et l'importation du tabac, et il sera alimenté de 2,5% de l'ensemble des taxes sur le tabac, plus 40% des amendes dues aux aux infractions dans le cadre de la loi tabac. Next one. Le slide suivant. Le slide suivant. Voilà. Donc, comme vous l'avez vu, l'utilisation de ce fonds, le premier fonds, c'est 85% pour les centres d'oncologie. Il y a un texte qui a distribué ces montants, 85% pour les centres d'oncologie. Donc, 75% de ces 85 sont destinés aux médicaments anticancéreux, car ils sont gratuits pour les malades, et donc on est obligé de les financer. Et le reste est destiné à l'acquisition de nouveaux équipements et de la recherche et de l'innovation. Les autres 15% qui sont destinés au programme de lutte contre les cancers, y compris le tabac, géré dans le cadre de notre direction, la Direction nationale de lutte contre les maladies non transmissibles, afin de justement remédier à lutter contre les facteurs de risque, et y compris le tabac. Next one. Le deuxième fonds, qui est le Fonds national de lutte contre le tabac, et c'est un fonds qui est créé par la loi et qui est en cours de finalisation. Les textes sont finis, maintenant il est en cours de dernier visage. J'espère que d'ici fin d'année, il sera mis en place de façon. Il a eu depuis longtemps pour être mis en place à cause des réticences du ministère des Finances. Dans ce fonds, les activités qui sont éligibles, c'est les activités de sensibilisation contre les méfaits du tabac et ses produits, tout le tabac d'ailleurs, donc la sensibilisation, les activités de lutte contre les facteurs de risque en santé de façon globale, les activités de dossérage tabagique, la formation du personnel de santé, le renforcement des capacités de l'ensemble des acteurs de l'état de tabac. C'est pour un peu essayer d'aider s'il y a la société civile pour être justement, et les autres secteurs qui ont besoin d'être renforcés dans ce cadre. Les célébrations des journées nationales et internationales de lutte contre le tabac, l'organisation des ateliers de planification pour essayer d'introduire le tabac dans l'ensemble des processus de planification du ministère de la Santé et des autres processus, le développement des politiques et stratégies et plans de lutte contre le tabac, le fonctionnement des équipements, des comités nationaux, parce que nous venons de mettre en place le comité national avec 15 comités régionaux et 58 comités de Mouqata.
Dr. Bob Abdel.
Yeah.
Are you almost done? I just wanted to sort of see if we could get into the questions. I think
Non, il me reste un peu. Voilà, le développement des politiques, tout simplement, c'est ça en fait le truc. J'aurais voulu tout simplement terminer par, c'est ça la liste des domaines éligibles sur le fonds. Et puis, on aura, ça c'est juste un partage avec vous sur ce qui se fait en Mauritanie dans ce cadre. Reste maintenant à savoir, et en conclusion, que dans le cadre de lutte contre le tabac pour le financement durable, nous avons besoin quand même de beaucoup de choses, des éléments essentiels, donc particulièrement un engagement politique fort et soutenu dans l'ensemble des acteurs. Nous avons besoin aussi de faire comprendre à nos amis du ministère des Finances que les lois de lutte contre le tabac sont des mesures de santé d'abord en priorité. Ce n'est pas la collecte de taxes seulement, mais surtout les résultats attendus de ces lois, c'est surtout la santé, c'est des résultats de santé essentiellement. Et puis le reste viendra après, en appui. Donc voilà, c'est ça, je reste et puis je resterai pour les questions s'il y en a d'autres.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so Abda, thank you very much for the presentation. I think we've got a good sense of the experience in Mauritania. I have one sort of quick question for you, and I think I was having a look at some of the data for Mauritania, and it sort of comes to some of what Jeremiah Paul was talking about earlier. Most countries, first look at, trying to address the challenge of, getting the structure right, getting the tax rates up in order to drive down consumption. But, Mauritania sort of put the cart before the horse, I think it is. You sort of quickly set up the fund before anyone was looking, and then now you want to sort of address some of the other challenges that you have. So, for instance, your tax structure is still ad valorem. which is not the sort of recommended uniform specific tax. Your tax rate is also relatively low compared to, I think, a lot of other African countries. So you still have quite a few challenges in that regard in terms of, you know, getting the structure right, getting the rate up. But you already have this fund, you know, already set up, and you're ready to get the money as soon as you get those two things right. So my question to you, Abda, is really, you know, is this something that you think was, you know, slightly easier for Mauritania to do? Was this a low-hanging fruit for you as a country that you thought, you know, let's quickly get this, and then we'll backtrack and start sorting out the actual structure and rates later on? What was the thinking exactly?
Merci Zonda, merci pour tout le monde. Je pense que d'après ce que l'expérience que nous avons eue, c'est au début on pensait que ça va nous faciliter la tâche. On crée un fonds, il y aura de l'argent là-dedans et puis on commence à exécuter les activités sans aucun problème. Alors que ce n'est pas le cas du tout. Parce qu'il y a une différence de compréhension dès le début entre ce qui est pensé au ministère de la Santé et ce que pensent nos amis du ministère des Finances. Pour nos amis du ministère des Finances, c'est une question de taxes et de collecte de taxes, pas plus. Ils doivent collecter les taxes, doivent tout faire pour collecter les taxes. Et pour eux, ils ont une ancienne règle qui est taxer plus, c'est-à-dire plus on taxe, on risque d'avoir du commerce illicite, de contrefaçon. Et puis, l'expérience que nous avons, donc on a heurté à ce problème. Il a fallu qu'on discute pendant longtemps avec les différentes équipes du ministère des Finances pour leur montrer que la loi anti-tabac, c'est une mesure de santé en toute priorité. Notre objectif dans la loi au début, c'est de protéger la santé des gens. Et maintenant, la taxe, c'est l'une des mesures qui nous facilite justement à garder et à maintenir la santé de cette population qui souffre justement des méfaits du tabac. Je pense personnellement que anticiper les fonds avant la réforme de la taxe, ce n'est pas une mauvaise chose parce que ça plutôt ça sensibilise les autres acteurs qui ne sont pas la santé, particulièrement le ministère des Finances, les parlementaires, à savoir qu'il y a des fonds et dans ces fonds-là, il faut mettre de l'argent. Et pour les mettre de l'argent, il faut justement voir quelle est la meilleure forme de taxe qui va permettre justement d'avoir tout ça. On n'a pas suffisamment de temps, de recul pour savoir véritablement avec certitude que scientifiquement on verra, mais l'impression que nous avons maintenant, je pense que ce n'était pas mauvais de fait de créer le fonds, même si l'un d'eux il est handicapé encore, il boite encore, mais ça sera une bonne chose pour essayer de sensibiliser et d'envoyer un message au gouvernement, aux autorités, aux parlementaires que ces fonds existent, il faut les alimenter et qui ont été créés par des lois et donc ça exige un tout petit peu une réforme qui permettra à ce que ces fonds soient alimentés et ce qui, en finalité, donne des ressources supplémentaires au ministère de la Santé afin de l'utiliser dans le cadre de lutte contre le tabac, mais aussi de l'utiliser dans le cadre de renforcement du système de santé de façon globale. Mais une condition était très importante. On a, dans ce cadre, on a besoin justement d'un engagement politique très fort et soutenu. Pourquoi soutenu? Pourquoi un engagement? Parce que nous avons connu plusieurs gouvernements. Les deux derniers gouvernements, un gouvernement très engagé, un autre gouvernement qui était plutôt, voilà, n'était pas très engagé dans ce domaine particulier. Bon, ça arrive dans tous les changements du gouvernement.
Yeah. Abda, thank you very much for that response. I'm going to cut you short. Unfortunately, we're sort of already a little over time based on what we had sort of scheduled. So I'm going to move on to Dr. Omondi, and hopefully, later on we can come back to some of the things that you've mentioned. I noticed there's a comment around taxation and illicit trade, which we might need to sort of get into at some point. But for now, thank you very much, Dr. Abda. I would like to move on to Dr. Gamaliel Omondi, who is from the Ministry of Health in Kenya. Dr. Omondi heads up the Occupational Health and Safety Unit, which is a division of environmental health at the Ministry of Health in Kenya. He's also in charge of the tobacco control enforcement in the country and coordinates many of the activities in all 47 counties of Kenya. Dr. Mondi is basically the technical lead for Tobacco Control Board Secretariat and occasionally serves as the alternate secretary when the substantive secretary is not available. So he's got quite a lot of experience and know-how for a lot of tobacco control activities for Kenya. Dr. Mondi, welcome and thank you for joining us. So to get us all started, I think I'll just sort of ask you a similar question to what I asked Abda. So we're getting country experiences for countries that already have, tobacco control funds set up. And Kenya has got some experience that I think you can help us understand and share. So maybe just start by, again, walking us through, what's Kenya's sort of setup? Where does the money come from? Where does it go? Who's administering the funds and how is that working currently for you? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair Zunda, and the other panelists together with the other participants. I'm very sorry that I joined a bit late. I'm multitasking in another meeting, but I will take the shortest time possible to walk you through. I believe everybody else is hearing me. Now, as Zunda has said, I will just take a short time to walk you through the establishment of the Tobacco Control Fund in Kenya. And as we are aware, or as we know, Kenya signed and ratified the WHO FCTC in 2004. And I think it was the second country after Norway. Then it domesticated the FCTC through Tobacco Control Act, Cap 245, in our Kenyan Book of Laws, which was enacted in 2007. We further followed this by developing tobacco control regulations, and we achieved this in 2014. However, amidst legal issues and litigations from the industry, we only managed to begin the implementation of the regulations in 2019. Now, it is within the regulations that we outlined very well the fund, because the Act just mentioned it. And under Section 7(1), then the regulations now came up with the amount of money that should be put there, and that is what we call solatium compensatory contribution from the industry. But the fund attracts also other sums that could be appropriated by Parliament, and also sums that can be realized from property forfeiture to the government under Section 52 of the Tobacco Control Act. And we also expect to receive money into this fund, including fees, contributions, gifts, or grants from or by any way of testamentary bequest by any person or persons, provided that such monies may not be received from any person that would create a conflict of interest. And the fund itself is expected to also invest. So then we expect that from investment of the fund, we can generate more funds going forward. And that investment is pursuant to Section 8, paragraph 2. Having said that, then we need to look quickly at the functions of the fund. And the fund basically addresses 4 elements which are expressly provided for in the Act. And number 1 is about research, documentation, and dissemination of information on tobacco and tobacco products, and promotion of national cessation and rehabilitation programs. And the third one talks of any other matter incidental to those 2 items, but also it provides a base on which the board can also be funded to operate its high-level functions, because we have a board which is existing, but the appropriations through Exchequer is normally very limited. So this fund will also support the operations of the board. Now, I need to touch briefly on a bit of progress that we have made in operationalization of the fund. I can say that this fund was operationalized. The process of operationalization began 2 years ago, immediately after the regulations were acceptable after the Supreme Court's ruling, because the industry contested the regulations right from the High Court to Court of Appeal, and we ended up in the Supreme Court that held it that anything else, public health, takes precedence, and that is how these regulations saw the light of the day. But it was not easy. So then we have an account in the central bank, and this account, that is where all the monies that are coming from the sources I mentioned earlier will be directed to. Then the Ministry of Health has also entered into an agreement with the Kenya Revenue Authority. We have what we call service level agreement for collection of the Solatium compensatory contribution. And our act says that they need to submit 2% of the profits made annually from imports, exports, and manufactured items in Kenya. And now the Kenya Revenue Authority will collect it automatically because they control the exports, they control imports, they also control items manufactured within the country. So we have agreed, the agreement has been signed, and they are just waiting to begin the collection. We also have established an interim secretariat of the fund that was appointed by the principal secretary. Actually, the principal secretary is the fund administrator according to Tobacco Control Act of Kenya. And so she can delegate the responsibilities to somebody that can be called a co-administrator or somebody running the fund on her or his behalf. So the ministry through the board and the Tobacco Control Unit has come up with several documents that will support the work on how the fund will be managed. So we have Tobacco Control Fund Operational Manual 2020. And in this manual, this is where now the board has been given 10% of the Solatium compensatory contribution remitted by the industry into this fund. So every other remittance, the board has 10% to ensure that their work of advisory, research, and every other thing is achieved. Then we have also developed Tobacco Control Fund regulations, Tobacco Control Fund Strategic Plan 2021-2026, and we are now almost finalizing on Tobacco Control Fund disbursement guidelines. We are saying disbursement guidelines because they are institutions that will require to be supported to do research, to be supported to undertake analytical issues like the laboratories. And so we must have some guidelines that will show how then we give money to this entity and leave this other entity.
Yeah. Dr. I'm going to cut you short. Unfortunately, we're sort of running out of time. I thank you very much for the opportunity to help us understand what's going on in Kenya. I will have some questions for you probably towards the end, but before we get into that, I would like to give a chance to Yolanda Richardson to also make some remarks, and then we'll hopefully open up and give you more chance to also give your input on some questions. So Yolanda is the Executive Vice President of Global Programs at the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. She has consulted widely for and with various private private companies, foundations, non-profit organizations, and she comes with years of experience of engagement with civil society at both international and at national levels. So Yolanda, it's a privilege to be with you on this session, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Zunda.
Yeah, so just to get started, I think we sort of agreed you would have a kind of introduction about what your thoughts are in terms of what engagement with civil society might look like in the ideal situation. So just go ahead and give us your presentation on that, and we can get into some questions after.
Sure, happy to do. So first of all, let me just say what a pleasure it is to join you all for the first African conference on tobacco and development. I'm excited to be here. The campaign has been honored to work with civil society and tobacco control advocates all around the world, but I must say our work here in Africa is especially meaningful, certainly for me. So it's great to have the opportunity to be here. As the other panelists have emphasized, we all know that tobacco tax is the most effective tool we have to drive down consumption, yet it is the policy that is the most difficult to get, and it lags behind other policy progress that we've seen in other places. I've been asked to specifically talk about the role of civil society in advocating for tobacco taxes and advocating for the establishment of special levies and special funds in order to both fund tobacco control, but broadly to fund public health activities. What you see on this slide briefly is kind of our way of thinking about this after many years of experience in working with civil society organizations around the world. We've created this sort of framework for how to think about managing tobacco control advocacy campaigns to raise taxes and to call for special levies, special taxes, special funds to support it. So I'll go through it very briefly, and then I'm open, Zunda, to questions from you or from other members who are attending today. So this framework has 6 components. At the very center is the development of a political strategy, which includes making sure that we understand exactly what the political ask is. Often when advocates are on the ground and they're not being as clear as is, I think, important to be, in exactly what are we asking for in the level of detail, including the level of technical detail that can allow the different stakeholders and the different policymakers to understand exactly what is being requested and asked by civil society. Then quickly around the political strategy development are 5 additional components that start with making sure that civil society has a partner with macroeconomic and fiscal expertise. Most of the groups we work with are public health groups, and so don't have that expertise within their organization. So it's really important in designing a tax campaign or a campaign for a special levy to make sure you partner with either an individual, but preferably with a civil society or a non-governmental organization that really understands fiscal policy and understands how to actually put together a proposal for a tax increase. The second key component to a successful campaign is making sure that we effectively engage with ministries of finance. The tobacco industry lives in ministries of finance. They are best friends. They never leave. There's lunch together, there's brunch together. And civil society groups, particularly those who work in the health sector, don't have those ties, don't have those connections, and therefore must really proactively try to seek out people who work within the Ministry of Finance so that they understand the constraints, the concerns, and the desires of people within the Ministry of Finance to actually be open to a tax or to a levy. The next component is being ready to counter the industry. This, I could go on and on and on and do an entire presentation on it alone. We all know that unlike every other public health issue, tobacco is completely different in the sense that it has to come up against the opposition of a very powerful, very well-resourced industry. And so being prepared to counter the industry arguments, and they never differ, no matter what country you're in, they're always the exact same arguments. So we can catalog and be ready to respond to those. On our own website, we have a document that talks about the typical arguments that the tobacco industry uses, and then the counter arguments. The 5th component is to just make sure you're collaborating. The bigger, the bolder, the more voices that are diverse that are advocating for tobacco tax increases to show public support, both to motivate policymakers to pass tobacco taxes, but for those policymakers that are already motivated, to give them political cover, to show that this is something that the public wants and that is popular and the public is behind them. And then lastly is to effectively use the media. We know that we've all been challenged in this last 2 years to figure out how to get the issues in front of key policymakers while this pandemic has raged. It's made it a particular challenge for us in the health sector. And social media it provides one opportunity to continue that ability to get in front of policymakers, but it also creates its own set of challenges. So this framework to us has been really helpful in when we sit down with tobacco control advocates at the country level to design their tax campaigns or to design their levy campaigns, to really do an assessment of whether or not the coalitions or the organizations are really prepared to take on the fight that will inevitably ensue when the tobacco industry gets any inkling that we're going to be pushing for this. Let me just add a couple more things, if I might, Zunda, just to sort of round out my discussion today. And that specifically is around sort of kind of what kind of things have made funds really successful when we've helped to support groups around the world. And one of the things is from the very beginning, making the case for why the funds are important and continuing that advocacy throughout. Because even once funds are established, the tobacco industry continues to try to undermine those funds in every way that it can. So being prepared to continue the campaigns even after the establishment of the funds is absolutely critical. And I can speak more to that if you like. So let me pause there and I welcome questions or comments.
Okay, Yolanda, thank you very much for that quick and precise presentation. The tobacco industry lives in the Ministry of Finance. Haven't quite heard that one before, but definitely something to keep in mind. So thank you very much for that. What I'd like to do at this point, I think, is just maybe invite the rest of the panelists to maybe turn on their cameras as well, so that we make it more of an open discussion, and I'll just be throwing questions to everyone across the room. But just to kind of start with, I wanted to give a chance to Dr. Omondi, who hasn't spoken as much, I think, as everyone else on the team, to just give us a sense of what you think, Dr. Omondi, were some of the big challenges in setting up this fund in Kenya, and how did you actually overcome the challenges? Just maybe one or two challenges that you came across there.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. In my opening statement on the establishment of the fund, I think I mentioned that the first biggest challenge was the opposition to the regulations, which were started in 2014, and then it moved on to the highest court of the land, and they were released in 2019. So the industry believed that the regulations were not good, and the biggest area of challenge was the Solatium compensatory contribution, that is the fund itself. That is what was challenged majorly, and the process of developing those regulations. There are only two things that we worked through and demonstrated very well through the support of the civil society in Kenya, and also the support of our political leaders in Kenya here. But it took us time to sit with the political arm of the government. We had a series of meetings with the health committees, the legal committee in parliament, education committee because of children, and we met like about 5 committees of parliament in preparation for this regulation. And we had documented every other step in that process. That is what saved us during the court hearing. Now, the second difficult part now is the compliance with that section that requires the tobacco industry to remit the 2% of their profits. That remains a contested issue. And so far as we speak, only one industry, the British American Tobacco, is the one that has submitted subsequently for the second year now, though we have not begun utilizing that money fully because we were still establishing the necessary documents and guidelines that will make us also be very transparent.
I think we've lost Dr. Omondi. Dr. Omondi, I think we've lost. Okay, we'll get back to Dr. Omondi, I think, when his network resumes. JP, there's some questions that keep coming up, I think, for you regarding a couple of different things with the WHO. I'm just trying to sort of read out the first one here for you. The first is, what is WHO's plan at the global level and regional level to engage Africans' fiscal authority with regards to effective tobacco taxation? I think this is a fairly simple one for you, JP. So
yeah, so we're really reaching out to partners like the World Bank, the IMF, OECD, and other partners, even in the Africa, ECOWAS, and UMOA, the African Development Bank, so that everyone is on the same page, that really tobacco taxation, particularly in the context of post-COVID response and recovery is really one of those low-hanging fruits
Yeah.
to raise revenues and address the health expenditures and health inequity. So we will accelerate this work. Of course, it's not easy because mosquitoes don't have lobbyists, but the tobacco industry has a lot. So it's really important that everybody, we work with civil society. It's really one key component also, apart from political will at the highest level. It's to put pressure. So we will essentially work at the global level and the regional level to advocate and push for tobacco taxation. And by the way, please read the manual, the WHO manual, tobacco tax policy administration.
Yes.
Yeah.
JP, it sounds like there's, sort of a coalition of forces, quite at work both at the, regional and international levels, I think, in terms of trying to push taxes forward. Another one for you, I'm wondering whether I should give this one to you again, but basically, so someone's asking, unfortunately, I don't have the names here, but it's basically, why do you think, JP, governments tend to shy away from anything related to health and finance, especially when we talk about raising taxes? What's the reason they tend to shy away?
Taxes is generally raising taxes is generally very political. However, that's why I put in my message there that you should frame tobacco taxes and other health taxes as a health measure and not as a revenue measure. And channeling those resources to health is really helps from a political economy perspective. So if people know where the revenues are going to, and Tobacco Control Fund is one of them, that it goes to health, it will certainly have buy-in. Again, I want to make sure, again, my other message is that if you establish a Tobacco Control Fund, please make sure that you spend the money, because if you don't spend the money, the Ministry of Finance will take that money away from you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, it's back to that question, that point you raised earlier about, the different things that, countries and institutions need to be thinking about even before you set up the fund. How exactly are you going to spend this money? Is it tractable? Are you able to do it within the time frame and so on? I think that speaks to that point. Yolanda, I'd like to turn back to you and maybe speak to some of the resources that are available for people to access in terms of just better understanding the issues around taxation, around how civil society can sort of build good campaigns. And related to that is a question I've just seen in the chat here from Bettina, which is, how best can we actually build confidence and capacity of CSOs on taxation issues to engage, ministries of finance. JP mentioned the tax manual that the WHO recently updated, which is one good resource, but I think Yolanda, you might also have some thoughts around that. And maybe you could also answer Bettina's question as well, I think, related to that.
Okay, thank you. The first question is, if you go to our website at www.tobaccofreekids.org, we have a whole section on taxation that looks at a range of issues there to support civil societies. There are a number of case studies there, including the case study around the Philippines tax, health tax, as we've just been told to refer to it. And that describes both, what government did, but what civil society did. I think we also, Dr. Mundi, have a case study around the Kenya tax, because it actually was really quite powerful when Kenya established its tax and put the infrastructure in place to support it. But in addition to that, we have a whole section on tobacco industry arguments and how to effectively counter those arguments. Because as I noted, those arguments don't differ by country. They're the exact same arguments they use in every single country, in every single context. And so being prepared for those arguments is really critically important. So those are some of the resources that are at our website, but I know WHO has quite a number of them. I know other organizations do as well. So quickly to Bettina's point about how do we build confidence of CSOs, my opinion about this is that CSOs become better advocates when they advocate. So it's getting out of there, learning the lessons of doing political engagement. Invariably, we have a 25-year history of doing political advocacy, and we're still learning how to do it, how to frame arguments, how to get the press to pay attention, how to get reluctant, political leaders to come to our side of the equation. But it really is just getting in there and doing it. But I would say just one thing about tax that's slightly different in terms of being a better tax advocate is making sure, as I said in that framework, you have a technical partner, because it is very technical. So when you get the opportunity to get in front of policymakers, particularly people who are in the Ministry of Finance, and you can only have a 2-line conversation with them, which is raise taxes, yay, they're kind of like, you really do need to have a technical partner there to support you and understanding all the different, variations of what the Ministry of Finance might be able to have as particular quivers to move the conversation forward. So those would be my my points.
Excellent, Yolanda. Thank you so much. You've actually spoken quite a lot with respect to, I think, what JP and what we actually at REAP also quite deal with frequently with regard to tobacco taxation. We've got literally 4 minutes left. I want to give Dr. Abda just 1 minute to just sort of give his final remarks, anything you would like to sort of give as a sort of take-home message to our audience, to ourselves, before we end the session. 1 minute for you, Dr. Abda. You have 1 minute.
Merci beaucoup, merci pour tout le monde. Je crois que la conclusion qu'on peut tirer de tout ça, cette expérience, c'est que nous avons un grand travail à faire avec le ministère des Finances. Quelqu'un l'a dit tout de suite, que ce sont des amis de l'industrie tabac. Dans tous les cas, ils sont beaucoup plus liés avec l'industrie tabac que le ministère de la Santé. Le deuxième point, il faut qu'on sache au ministère des Finances que les mesures ou les lois anti-tabac sont des mesures pour protéger la santé. Donc, on devrait tout faire pour protéger la santé et ne pas collecter l'argent ou regarder les prix, ce qui n'est pas ça. Je veux tout simplement aussi répondre un peu à quelqu'un qui a envoyé un message pour dire que je n'ai pas du tout dit que le commerce illicite, je sais que le commerce illicite, c'est un phénomène qui est trop lié aux organisations de terrorisme, aux organisations même de banditisme, etc. Mais j'ai dit tout simplement que le ministère des Finances, certains collègues, pensent que si on taxe beaucoup, on va on va favoriser justement ce commerce illicite, alors que ce n'est pas vrai. Ça, on le sait que ce n'est pas vrai. Donc, c'était ça. On a besoin, dans tous les cas, on a besoin d'un engagement politique très fort à tous les niveaux. Je crois que c'est surtout l'essentiel. Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Abda. Yolanda, I'll turn back to you. 1 minute. Do you have any last thoughts, parting thoughts for us, for the rest of the audience?
I would just say everyone should listen to JP. He has experience of doing it in Philippines, and he's now at WHO with resources to help countries do it. So.
Yeah. And we saved the best for last, JP. So there you go. Your 1 minute.
No, it's yeah, tobacco taxation is win-win-win. It's really a win for revenues, win for public health, and a win for equity. Don't be scared, be bold, and raise tobacco taxes.
Yeah, I like that. Be bold. Yeah, let's do this. We're a country, we're a continent on the move, and we're a world on the move. And I think, one thing that COVID-19 has taught us is that we are more resilient than we know. And, being bold, I think, is part of all of that. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to the panelists for your sessions, for being excellent with your time. Unfortunately, Dr. Omondi dropped off the call. He's not able to rejoin. I think he might have internet issues, but we really are very happy that he was able to join us for the time that he had. And thank you to the audience as well for joining us. We wish you the very best for the rest of the sessions this week, and good luck to everyone. And it's been my singular honor. Thank you for everybody, and have a good week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.